Rain pooled in the grooves of Briarwick's cobblestone lanes, turning the village square into a gray mirror that reflected both the sky's gloom and the mood of its people. Arabella Whitcombe stood beneath the magistrate's portico with her basket held tight against her apron, breath misting in the chill as she waited for him to inspect the golden pie she had prepared with painstaking care. She had risen before dawn, coaxing warmth into the old family oven, whispering hope into the dough as though it might hear her. But now, faced with the magistrate's curled lip and the gathering crowd, her confidence faltered. He prodded the pie's crust with the tip of a silver fork, sniffed sharply, and announced, in a voice as cold as the drizzle, that no village baker's daughter should presume toward refinement. The words fell like a sentence, and the ripple of laughter from those gathered struck harder than the rain. Arabella lowered her gaze, swallowing the sting as the magistrate dismissed her with a flick of his hand, leaving her humiliation exposed beneath the dripping eaves. She walked away from the portico with measured steps, determined not to betray the tremble threatening her composure. Briarwick was small, and cruelty traveled swiftly. Already she could hear the whispers that she was too proud, too ambitious, too eager to be more than she was. Her golden pie had been meant as a gesture of goodwill, an offering to someone who might help her secure opportunities beyond the village bakery. Instead, it had become a spectacle. Holding her basket closer, she quickened her pace toward the familiar scent of hearth smoke rising from Whitcombe Bakery. The warmth inside wrapped around her like a balm, though it did little to muffle the echo of ridicule still circling her thoughts. Her father glanced up from kneading dough when she entered, his brow furrowing at the sight of her reddened cheeks. She gave a small shake of her head, unwilling to recount the morning's cruelty. He said nothing, simply set aside his work and touched her shoulder with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. It should have been enough, this haven, this constancy, but Arabella could not quiet the gnawing ache of wanting more, not for riches or status, but for the chance to create something recognized, valued, remembered. Her golden pie had been born of that longing, a recipe inherited from her late mother, its crust brushed with a glaze that shimmered like sunlight. Now it felt foolish to have hoped it might open any door. She moved to the window to lose herself in the rain outside, only to notice a horseman approaching, a tall figure in dark livery bearing the unmistakable crest of Blackthorn Hall. The bakery bell jingled as he entered, bringing a gust of cold air and a solemn formality that filled the small shop. Without preamble, he produced a sealed letter stamped with wax, the Harwood emblem. Arabella stared, unsure whether awe or dread should take hold. The messenger announced that she was requested for temporary culinary service at the hall in preparation for the Duke's upcoming banquet. Requested, not invited, summoned, though the letter never used such a word. Her father's brows rose, his hands still dusted with flour. The villagers who drifted past the window slowed to stare, their curiosity sharpening into palpable speculation. Arabella broke the seal with unsteady fingers and read the letter twice, scarcely believing it. The Duke Edmund Harwood was known throughout the region not for warmth, but for the severity that had earned him the moniker, the Cold Duke. Few saw him, fewer spoke to him, and no one of Arabella's station had reason to be within a mile of Blackthorn Hall. Yet here was the summons, formal, clipped, and undeniably real. Rumors spiraled through Briarwick before the horseman even departed. Some claimed the Duke sought novelty for his table. Others whispered that he wished to correct the scandals lingering from his late father's mismanaged affairs. The more cruel voices suggested he might need a distraction, someone convenient to bear the brunt of noble scrutiny. Arabella ignored them all, though unease sketched its shadow across her thoughts. The Duke's world was not hers. His halls were filled with people who would see her as an intruder, a servant brought in for temporary use, nothing more. Yet she agreed to go. Opportunity rarely knocked for those without a title, and she would not be the one to turn it away simply because fear urged caution. Early the next morning, she boarded the carriage sent for her. The journey to Blackthorn Hall wound through forests thick with mist, the trees rising like ancient sentinels guiding her toward a fate she could not yet name. When the carriage finally creaked to a halt before the estate, she stepped out into a world that felt carved from another life entirely. Towering stone walls, windows gleaming with candlelight, and a silence so profound it seemed almost watchful. A steward escorted her inside, and she followed through corridors lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress. At last she was led into a study lit by a tall, crackling fire. There she met him, the Duke himself, standing with the posture of a man shaped by duty rather than desire. He studied her, his expression unreadable, his voice low and cool as he confirmed her purpose. She was there to bake, nothing more. His world, he implied, had no room for sentiment. Her task was clear, her boundaries fixed. Yet, as Arabella nodded, she caught a flicker, just a moment, of something uncertain in his gaze, as though her presence stirred a memory he had not expected to feel. She did not know then how tightly that fleeting glance would cling to her thoughts, nor how soon she would learn that even the coldest walls could crack. But as the steward dismissed her to the kitchens, one truth settled into the air between them. The story had already begun its quiet turning. Arabella rose before dawn on her second morning at Blackthorn Hall, drawn from sleep by the quiet hum of a household already stirring with purpose. The kitchen, vast and dimly lit, greeted her with its regimented order. Rows of copper pots polished to a mirror sheen, stone floors swept to immaculate smoothness, and servants moving with disciplined precision. Despite its grandeur, the room felt strangely cold, as though the estate's somber temperament seeped into its very walls. She set to work immediately, gathering the ingredients she had requested the night before. The hall stores were impeccable: fresh cream, perfect butter, and fruit preserved with near reverence. Yet she felt the kitchen staff watching her with a mixture of caution and curiosity, as if waiting to learn whether the rumors whispered about the baker's daughter were truth or folly. As she rolled the dough for her golden pie, the aroma of warm spices began to soften the air, loosening the tension around her. A few of the younger servants hovered near, drawn by fascination more than duty, although none dared approach too closely. Arabella kept her focus deliberate, aware that every movement formed part of an unofficial test, one she could not afford to fail. The pie was not merely food. It was proof that she belonged here long enough to complete the task for which she had been summoned. By the time the crust had taken on its gilded sheen beneath the heat of the grand oven, the kitchen's earlier reservations had shifted into murmured admiration. Word of her work traveled quickly, as things tended to in a great house where gossip ran faster than footmen. When the Duke entered the kitchen, an occurrence so rare that even the head cook stiffened, Arabella felt her heartbeat thrum against her ribs. Edmund Harwood surveyed the room with the same frost-kissed composure he had shown her in his study, his gaze sweeping over the staff before settling on the golden pie cooling near the window. He approached with deliberate steps, the room falling silent around him. Arabella braced herself for criticism, a habit forged by experiences far less grand than this. But the Duke merely studied the pie with an expression she could not decipher, his tone measured as he asked whether it was her creation. When she confirmed it, he nodded once. A gesture small enough to be overlooked, except that silence rippled through the kitchen as if he had bestowed a rare commendation. The Duke's acknowledgement should have comforted her, yet Arabella sensed a subtler change. His eyes, though distant, held a glimmer of something cautious, almost reluctant, intrigue attempting to disguise itself beneath rigidity. It unsettled her more than disdain would have. She knew better than to imagine it meant anything, yet she could not deny feeling seen in a way she had not expected. Later that afternoon, while passing through a narrow corridor, she noticed the Duke standing before a portrait of his late father. The stern lines of his posture betrayed a heaviness he tried to mask, and before she could stop herself, she offered a quiet remark about grief being a loyal shadow. He turned toward her, surprise flickering across his features at the boldness of her words. For one suspended moment, neither spoke. Then he inclined his head slightly, not in offense, but in acknowledgement. That single, unexpected exchange sparked a tremor throughout the household. News spread with astonishing speed. Servants whispered that the baker's daughter had addressed the Duke with disarming familiarity, and though their tones were hushed, their meaning was unmistakable: caution, curiosity, and budding scandal intertwined. Arabella felt each stare as she carried on with her duties, determined not to shrink from scrutiny. Yet her stomach tightened with every passing hour, knowing that proximity to a man of Edmund's station placed her on a precipice she had never chosen. The next morning, she found a neatly folded embroidered towel beside her workstation, initialed with her name. It could have been left by anyone, but the material was too fine, the stitching too precise. When she asked the kitchen staff about it, they exchanged pointed glances and offered evasive answers. She tucked the towel away, unsure whether to treat it as gratitude, warning, or something far more complicated. The Duke avoided the kitchen that day, but his absence did little to quiet the speculation growing around her. The banquet preparations intensified as nobility began arriving earlier than expected, their carriages lining Blackthorn's sweeping drive. Snatches of conversation drifted through the corridors, discussions of alliances, strategic marriages, and political leverage. Arabella heard her name once or twice, spoken with airy disdain by guests who barely bothered lowering their voices. They viewed her as an oddity, a temporary amusement to dissect between sips of sherry. One woman in particular, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, observed Arabella with a gaze sharp enough to cut silk. Her interest was not admiration, but something colder, more calculating. That evening, while carrying linens down a dim hallway, Arabella rounded a corner too swiftly and nearly collided with the Duke. He steadied her instinctively, his hand closing around her arm with surprising gentleness. The intimacy of the moment, fleeting, accidental, yet undeniably charged, did not escape the eyes of the two footmen standing nearby. They exchanged a look that made Arabella's breath falter. Edmund released her at once, stepping back with visible restraint, but the damage had already been done. By nightfall, the whispers grew sharper, louder, and she sensed the story twisting into something perilous. When she returned to the kitchens, the head cook informed her in a hushed voice that rumors were spreading across the hall with reckless enthusiasm. Arabella felt her face heat with mortification. Yet beneath the shame lay something more troubling. The fear that this uninvited attention would cost her the position she had barely begun to hold. As she prepared for the next day's tasks, a single thought pressed against her heart. One encounter could unravel everything she had worked to achieve. And somewhere beyond the clamor of gossip, she could not shake the feeling that Edmund himself sensed the shifting tide. Though whether he feared it or welcomed it, she could not yet tell. Lantern light spilled across the glass walls of the winter conservatory, casting soft, wavering reflections upon the marble floor. Arabella hesitated at the threshold, uncertain why the Duke had summoned her to such an intimate space. The conservatory was warm despite the brisk air outside, a sanctuary of green vines and winter blossoms shielded from the harshness of the season. Rain trickled steadily across the panes overhead, filling the silence with a muted rhythm that almost masked the sound of Edmund Harwood's footsteps as he approached her from deeper within the room. His expression held none of the distant chill she had come to expect. Instead, his gaze carried a quiet conflict, as though he had been wrestling with shadows only he could see. He offered a brief apology for the hour, his voice low and uncharacteristically unsteady. Arabella assured him she took no offense, though her pulse beat a nervous cadence beneath her calm exterior. The events of the previous night, the whispers, the accusing looks, the accidental closeness in the corridor, still weighed heavily on her mind. Standing before him now, she sensed that he felt the strain of it as well. He gestured toward a small bench nestled between potted camellias, a gesture more tentative than commanding. She sat with careful poise, attempting to anchor her thoughts as he remained standing, his posture taut with unspoken intent. Edmund spoke first of the rumors, his words clipped yet tinged with restrained frustration. He disliked the household's gossip, despised that servants or guests felt entitled to dissect the lives of others. He assured her that she had done nothing wrong, yet the way he said it revealed that he blamed himself for the scandal's spark. Arabella watched him quietly, struck by how the Duke, so controlled, so distant, seemed almost humanly unsettled now. He stepped closer, stopping just short of breaching propriety, and confessed that her earlier remark about grief had taken him off guard. It had reminded him, he said, of truths he had spent years avoiding. The room felt smaller as he began speaking of his father, a man whose legacy was marred by political missteps and social disgrace. Edmund explained that inheriting the estate had forced him to shoulder not only land and title, but the heavy residue of public disappointment. The nobility had awaited his failure. Society had watched to see if he would repeat his father's mistakes. He had responded by shutting the world out, maintaining such rigid composure that no one dared look beyond it. His confession flowed haltingly, as though each sentence cost him something. Arabella listened with earnest attention, humbled that he entrusted her with a past he had shared with no other. When he concluded, a long silence filled the conservatory. Arabella felt an ache she could neither name nor dismiss, a sympathy that reached deeper than politeness allowed. She spoke quietly of her own burdens, admitting that her confidence masked years of insecurity born from repeated humiliation. She told him of the magistrate's scorn, of villagers who mocked her aspirations, and of the constant fear that any misstep might shatter her hopes entirely. She did not embellish the truth, nor attempt to soften it. Her honesty settled between them like a fragile bloom, and she sensed that her vulnerability surprised him even more than her earlier boldness. As she spoke, she saw Edmund's expression shift from detached interest to something far more personal. He lowered himself to the opposite end of the bench, leaving enough distance to satisfy propriety, but not enough to erase the tension humming beneath the surface. Arabella felt his eyes linger on her, searching for something he could not yet articulate. She turned to meet his gaze, and in that wordless exchange lay a dangerous clarity. They understood one another in ways neither had expected nor intended. His hand lifted slightly, reaching toward her face with a gentleness that startled her. A faint streak of flour, unnoticed until now, marked her cheek. He seemed about to brush it away, yet at the final moment he withdrew, fingers curling against the restraint ingrained in him by title and expectation. The aborted gesture hung in the air, more intimate than if he had touched her. Arabella's breath caught, though she masked it behind a composed stillness. The Duke stood abruptly, as though remaining seated would betray too much, and turned toward the rain-smeared glass to regain command of himself. Before either could speak again, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Lord Ashcombe appeared in the doorway, his face carefully schooled, but his eyes sharp with shrewd calculation. He surveyed the scene, the secluded conservatory, the lowered tones, the unmistakable tension, and offered a bow tinged with condescension. Edmund greeted him with curt civility, yet Arabella could feel the shift in the air. Ashcombe's gaze lingered on her a shade too long, as though he had discovered a secret he intended to exploit. Once the lord departed, Edmund's expression hardened. He informed Arabella, with clear reluctance, that the situation had become precarious. Her presence, though innocent, had ignited speculation Ashcombe would undoubtedly twist for his own political use. A murmur of something like regret colored his voice as he explained that it would be safer if she left Blackthorn Hall at dawn. The decision, he said, was not a reflection of her conduct but a necessity of circumstance. Arabella felt the words strike with quiet force. She nodded, keeping her composure, though her heart strained against the verdict. As she rose to leave, Edmund stepped forward as if to stop her, then hesitated, his restraint returning like a shield. She offered him a soft farewell and turned toward the door, her footsteps echoing gently behind her. The conservatory's warm glow faded as she walked away, and though the ending of their conversation offered no comfort, it carried a lingering tension that promised the story between them was not yet done. The dawn that crept over Blackthorn Hall carried none of the serenity that usually softened the estate's rugged contours. Arabella rose before the sun, her thoughts restless and hollowed by the weight of Edmund's decision. The servants who had grown fond of her gathered quietly in the kitchen, offering subdued farewells as she packed the few belongings she had brought. Their downcast expressions pierced her, for they understood with unspoken clarity that she was not leaving because her work had failed, but because politics had slithered into the spaces where simple human decency had once taken root. She folded the embroidered towel the Duke had left her days before. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she could scarcely explain, set it gently upon the table. She could not accept a token from a life she had never truly belonged to. Outside, the sky was a sullen slate, the wind stirring the lingering fragrance of the garden as she stepped toward the waiting carriage. She felt the hall watching her, as though its stone walls retained a memory of her presence and were reluctant to release it. Before she reached the carriage door, she paused, turning once more to take in the austere grandeur of the place that had, for a brief moment, allowed her to glimpse the possibility of something more. She whispered a soft farewell to no one in particular, then climbed inside. Across the estate, Edmund stood in his father's old study, jaw clenched as Lord Ashcombe delivered his ultimatum. The older man recited scandal with a polished ease, outlining precisely how the Duke's reputation could unravel. Rumors of impropriety, whispers of favoritism, insinuations of intimacy between a nobleman and a baker's daughter, all could be shaped into weapons capable of igniting the very disgrace Edmund's father had left behind. Ashcombe's expression bore a smug restraint as he suggested that marriage to Lady Beatrice would nullify the threat. Stability, he claimed, required sacrifice. The Duke felt each word like an iron weight pressed against his ribs. Edmund dismissed him with frigid courtesy, but the moment Ashcombe departed, his composure fractured. He strode toward the window, the glass misting faintly beneath his breath as he stared out across the grounds. Arabella's carriage had begun its slow descent down the drive. His decision to send her away, the one he had convinced himself was necessary, now felt like betrayal. Not of duty, but of himself. He was a man raised to believe emotion was weakness, affection a liability, longing a danger. But every instinct within him rebelled against letting her leave. She had seen him, understood him, spoken to him without pretense or expectation. She had offered him honesty where others offered strategy, warmth where others offered advantage. By the time he called for his horse, a storm had begun to gather. The clouds, swollen and dark, burst as he galloped down the drive, rain slashing across his coat. He cared nothing for the spectacle he created, nor for the retainers who watched in astonishment as their Duke abandoned dignity to chase a single carriage like a man possessed. Mud streaked the horse's flanks, wind roared in his ears, and the world narrowed to the single truth he could no longer deny. He would not lose her, not to Ashcombe, not to gossip, not to the suffocating expectations of a society that thrived on coldness. Arabella felt the carriage shudder to a halt. The footman cracked the door ajar, his expression stunned as the Duke dismounted and strode toward her with rain-soaked determination. She stepped out hesitantly, clutching her shawl as the storm lashed around them. Edmund stopped only inches away, his breath uneven, his composure shattered beyond repair. She had never seen him so unguarded, so fiercely alive. "Marry me, Arabella," he said, the words torn from him with the urgency of a man who had outrun every doubt. "Let the world think me reckless, misguided. Let them call me whatever they wish. I choose you, and I will not be commanded into a loveless union to preserve a title that means nothing without you." Her heart hammered against her ribs, disbelief mingling with fear. She reminded him of the cost, of the eyes watching from every corner of society, of the repercussions that might echo through his lineage. But Edmund seized her hands, not with force, but with desperate sincerity, and replied, "I have lived my entire life beneath the weight of others' expectations. You're the first choice I make for myself. Do not ask me to retreat from it." His voice cracked on the final words, and the rawness of it unraveled the last thread of restraint within her. She whispered that she loved him, the confession trembling out like a truth long held captive. Relief washed over him with such intensity he closed his eyes, briefly overwhelmed. When he opened them again, the storm seemed to soften, as though the world itself acknowledged the shift between them. They returned to Blackthorn Hall together, sodden but resolute. The guests who had gathered for the banquet murmured with shock as Edmund entered the grand vestibule with Arabella at his side. He stood before them, rain still dripping from his coat, and declared his intention to marry her. The word carried through the hall like a toll of judgment and liberation all at once. Lady Beatrice's supporters bristled with indignation, but before their objections could take form, the Dowager Duchess of Wexley stepped forward. With a measured, imperious calm, she commended Edmund's decision, remarking that character surpassed lineage and that Arabella's integrity shamed those who dared whisper against her. Her influence silenced opposition, and Ashcombe's threats withered beneath the scrutiny of noble eyes. Their wedding took place the next morning in the quiet chapel overlooking the eastern gardens. Light streamed through stained glass in gentle hues, illuminating Arabella's trembling smile as Edmund vowed to cherish her. When they emerged hand in hand, the storm had cleared, leaving the grounds washed in a soft gold that echoed the pie that had first drawn her here. She had come a Blackthorn Hall to bake, nothing more. Yet as Edmund brushed a tear from her cheek and pressed a reverent kiss to her brow, she understood that she had become something far greater. The transformation he had never believed possible, and the future he finally allowed himself to choose.